Good evening, everyone. Nice to see everyone here. Good to see the room. It is just about filled up, which is great. I'm Helena Berger. I am the chair of the board of the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee and also a proud alum of American University. I graduated from what used to be called the School of Public Affairs, which is now SPA. So that will tell you I graduated quite a while ago, but I'll leave you guessing at my graduation date. The FDR Committee is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to protect, preserve, and promote the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Memorial, located actually not too far from this campus. The FDR Committee is proud to be co-hosting this event with AU's Office of Inclusive Excellence, the Department of History, and 250 at American. Thank you, AU, for your partnership and for valuing, elevating, and including the important discussion in your 250 at American events. And a very heartfelt thank you to Mary Dolan, our co-founder and executive director, and to Liv Holmes, I don't know where she, oh, there she is in the back, who is the special assistant to the executive director, for your many hours of devoted hours, I should say, to making this event a success. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the completion of the FDR Memorial with the addition of the FDR wheelchair statue. Tonight, you will learn about the fight for the statue that changed forever how FDR is remembered, and rightfully shows that leadership and greatness can and does look like a person with a disability. FDR's character and abilities were transformed by his lived experience with a disability. As documented in Jonathan Darman's book, Becoming FDR, The Personal Crisis That Made a President, qualities such as empathy, mental toughness, patience, strategic thinking, and effective communication, skills so essential to FDR's success as president, were the skills he acquired while adapting to his disability between 1921, when he contracted polio, and 1928, when he successfully ran for governor of New York. And arguably, the most crucial quality that he discovered during that 7-year journey was how to find hope, and what he and many of his contemporaries thought was a hopeless situation, a skill that he employed to motivate Americans throughout the Great Depression and World War II. A key quote by Eleanor Roosevelt at the FDR Memorial states, "Franklin's illness gave him strength and courage he had not had before. He had to think about the fundamentals of living and learn the greatest lessons of all, infinite patience and never-ending persistence." I think if I could channel FDR tonight, he would appreciate the collaboration between our organization and AU's Office of Inclusive Excellence in co-hosting this event. I recently read the aim of the Office of Inclusive Excellence is to, quote, "live out our values of inclusive excellence by leading with conviction, modeling compassion, and inspiring efforts that build a better world for all of us." I think their aim truly embodies the outstanding qualities and leadership demonstrated by FDR. Before I introduce Dr. Friday, Vice President of Inclusive Excellence, I want to take a moment to recognize and thank our major donors who helped make this evening possible. Gordon and Laura Gunn Foundation, Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation, Dr. Lucy Waletsky, Jane Delan in honor of Mike Delan, Lakeshore Foundation in honor of John Kemp and John Langen, who is here. So a special shout out to John. Thank you for your support. I also want to recognize my fellow board members who are in the audience and ask them to please wave or stand. Brian Coyne and Arlene King-Berry. And, oh, and perfect timing, Joe Diaz. And now I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Nkinji Friday, the inaugural Vice President of Inclusive Excellence at AU. She leads the Office of Inclusive Excellence, whose mission is to foster community, value diverse perspectives, and address issues of discrimination and harassment to promote equity and inclusion across campus. A special thank you to you, Dr. Friday, for your leadership in helping ensure disability history and stories are woven into the fabric of this great institution, and that everyone feels included and can fully participate in all aspects of their AU experience. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Friday.
Good evening. Oh my, good evening. Sorry, I gotta just turn a page here. All right. So I want to welcome you all officially on behalf of American University, the 250 Plus American University Initiative, and of course on behalf of our president, Jonathan Alger. It truly is my honor as Vice President to welcome you to this special event, commemorating the 25th anniversary of the wheelchair statute for the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial. When I was initially looped into a conversation, I remember being so incredibly excited. Excited as the Vice President of Inclusive Excellence can be, right? Namely because I was a former presidential scholar, and even though FDR was not one of those presidents that I studied explicitly, I do have an affinity for Eleanor Roosevelt in particular. So to see this come to AU, at a time where there are significant challenges in our nation truly is, I think, a monumental experience for my office and for American University. So I actually thank the FDR Memorial in particular for even approaching us for this particular partnership. So tonight, we gather in partnership with the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee, our Department of History, to celebrate a milestone in disability representation and inclusive commemoration. I do want to thank all our partners, the organizers, our community members who made this meaningful gathering possible. The wheelchair statute stands not only as a tribute to President Roosevelt, but as a powerful symbol of recognition, dignity, and the ongoing fight for visibility. Its presence reminds us that history must include the stories and experiences of all Americans. By honoring this anniversary, we reaffirm our commitment to accessibility, inclusion, and the belief that everyone deserves to be at the table. This evening's program features the award-winning documentary, FDR Great Abilities, followed by a panel discussion with the film's narrator, a leading disability rights activist, and distinguished AU scholars. Their insights will help us explore how FDR's disability shaped his leadership and how grassroots advocacy ensured that his legacy reflects the lived experiences of disabled Americans. Through collaborative programming such as tonight's event, they foster dialogue, education, and engagement that highlight the importance of disability rights and the broader movement in its connectedness to social justice. As part of 250 Plus at American University, marking the nation's semi-quincentennial, we invite you to reflect on representation in history and memorials. Who is remembered? Who is honored? And how can civic engagement shape a more inclusive future? These questions are vital as we strive to advance democracy, foster accessibility, and build a culture where everyone belongs. So thank you all for joining us. Your presence and your participation are what makes moments like these possible. Let us learn, reflect, and continue to commit ourselves to the work of inclusion and excellence collectively. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing Mary Dolan. Mary Dolan, yeah, please. Mary Dolan is the co-founder and executive director of the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee. She is also a proud alum of American University's School of International Service. Please join me in welcoming Mary.
Good evening, everyone. This is really terrific to have you all here. Thank you for coming out. Thank you, Dr. Friday. Thank you for the support from your office for this event. Thank you, Elizabeth, for everything you've done to make this possible. Thank you to my board for being here and also believing in this event and honoring the wheelchair statue anniversary in the way that we are going to this year. And mind you all, this is one of several events we're going to be having this year. So at the back of the programs, there are QR codes for 2 other events we're going to be having in May. One will be at the memorial. So if you don't see the QR code, just check it out on our website or come talk to me or Liv, who I'm also going to Liv Homes. Please wave your hand over there. Thank you, Liv, for all of your help today. And not just today, she knows that. And finally, also, of course, the Department of History for also believing in this. Dr. Friedman and Dr. Curtin for believing in this idea of bringing this program to American University, my alma mater, which I'm so proud of. So a little bit about the FDR Memorial. It is owned and operated by the National Park Service. And the Park Service depends on private support to help preserve our nation's cultural and environmental resources. That's where we come in, because as good as the Park Service is, they can't do it all. So our mission is to protect, preserve, and promote the FDR Memorial. And through this event, we're going to do all 3. We're going to protect a legacy of the disability community's amazing contribution to the FDR Memorial. We're going to preserve the narratives that make up the history of this memorial, and we're going to promote these stories and the entire memorial to a new generation, the students of American University. And even if you're not at American University, you're part of learning the narrative and carrying it on to wherever you're going to go. But be mindful that we are an organization that is fully dedicated to the entire memorial. The disability story is part of our story, our genesis of our organization, but we are fully committed to ensuring every inch of that 7.5-acre memorial is protected, preserved, and promoted. I couldn't be more proud to present this award-winning documentary. It's a short doc, FDR Great Abilities. Dr. Boone, who had a hand in this, is also in the audience today. So thank you, Dr. Boone, for flying in from Atlanta. I know you see your hand in this at certain points, so thank you for that. So this film is a classic underdog story. It's how a small group of people took on official Washington, all the powers that be, and won. That doesn't happen a lot these days, does it? Does it ever happen? Not enough people know this story, and that's why we're here today. So many people who visit the memorial, they don't realize that the statue was added after a bitter fight led by disabled people. People don't know that it took 6 years to wage the campaign for the statue. People don't know that everyone was against the disability community's call to show FDR in a wheelchair. I'm talking Congress, the White House, some members of the Roosevelt family, the designer of the memorial, and even the Park Service. And maybe folks also don't know that the disability community ultimately raised every penny for the statue. The addition of the statue is not just a one-off feel-good win, but rather it's part of the trajectory of the fight for rights and recognition by disabled Americans. And many of the people who fought for the statue and who you're going to see on the video are the people who secured the wins that gave us the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And if you want to wonder why you were able to enter an accessible building today, or maybe you had an IEP when you were in school, or you have some accommodations now at American, it's because of the folks who fought for this statue and continued the fight back in the 90s to make sure that statue got added. Because the statue is an extension of the ongoing fight for disabled people to have their rightful place in America. And we owe them a great debt. Many of our leaders have gone before us, including my old bosses, Mike DeLand and Alan Reich, who took this fight on head first. And they brilliantly hired Jim Dickson, who's over there, to direct the campaign. And you're going to hear from him, along with some other amazing leaders, about the campaign and perspectives about FDR. The film was created in 4 5-minute segments to invite discussion and discovery along the way for young people in school. So as we're running it, you might notice some brief interruptions as we transition to the next segment. The film was funded by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Telling the Full History Preservation Fund, with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, with matching funds from the Gordon and Laura Gund Foundation. I always have to say that. It was produced by Kate Hammond and executive produced by Ben Patterson of Onslaught Films. So, without further ado, I hope the film will roll brilliantly. I hope you enjoy it.
The Monument Problem. Emily Kitchen, friend of the FDR Memorial.
I love history, especially stories you can't find in textbooks. There's a story more people should know. It has all the ingredients: intrigue, drama, passion, and justice.
Men using wheelchairs.
It's about a group of people inspired by the movement for disability rights and one of our greatest presidents, Franklin Roosevelt.
A photo portrait.
Along with the complexities of memorializing historical figures as time and social progress march on.
Various memorials.
From the Statue of Liberty to Mount Rushmore, monuments and memorials are foundational to understanding and honoring American history.
Nyla Morton.
But as historical figures' likeness and legacies get set in stone, literally, our understanding of history evolves, creating tension between past and progress. We saw this come to a head in 2020 in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. Protests erupted. Monuments honoring historical figures were spray painted, beheaded, pushed into harbors, and removed. From Robert E. Lee to the 17th century, English slave traders, statues internationally failed.
Controversy around memorials goes way, way back. In 1776, to celebrate the Declaration of Independence's first reading, a group of patriots pulled down a statue of British King George III, melting it to make bullets to fight the British.
A painting of the incident.
Which brings us to our lesser-known story. In the 1990s, another statue was the focus of a major controversy.
A map highlighting Washington.
The Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C.
FDR's cape hides his wheelchair.
Looking at the original statue, you wouldn't know President Roosevelt, also known as FDR, had a disability and spent much of his life in presidency in a wheelchair.
That's why the memorial, which concealed FDR's disability, began a battle led by people living with disabilities, with help from allies.
President Bill Clinton.
A struggle for historical accuracy and disability representation within a broader, bitter fight for disability rights. Like the backlash against monuments in 2020, these activists demanded history's whole story be told.
But what did living with a disability look like for President
Black
Roosevelt?
and white film of
The
Roosevelt.
Depression-era president moved between hiding his paralysis, fearing people would question his competence, and proudly cementing a legacy as the first president living with a disability, creating policies, institutions that improved the lives of other disabled people along the way. How to depict someone from a complex personal identity was a central question in the fight to create an accurate representational memorial experience. How should history recognize and remember FDR?
A persisting presidency. Nyla Morton, disability activist.
Elected 4 times, a historical first, FDR became president in 1933 and served until 1945. He also lived with polio.
Braces on Roosevelt's legs.
Behind the scenes for years, Roosevelt's focus moved from politics to learning to live with paralysis. Because of the stigma surrounding people with disabilities, FDR downplayed his disability.
Emily Kitchen, friend of the memorial.
12 years FDR was president, a lot of stuff went down. The country was in the midst of the Great Depression, and I'm not talking about its mental health.
A food line.
Great is a misnomer. It was a bad economic downturn. In response, President Roosevelt created the New Deal, a program providing a safety net and job opportunities, restoring a sense of purpose and hope. Overseas, World War II was brewing.
Marching troops.
The attack on Pearl Harbor brought America into the fold. Roosevelt spearheaded massive wartime efforts until the war's end.
FDR signing documents.
While establishing Social Security benefits and building the Pentagon, FDR was only able to walk short distances wearing iron braces, supporting himself with a cane, and often clinging to the arm of his son.
He often used a special wheelchair he designed himself, replacing the legs of a dining chair with bicycle-like wheels to be more discreet and easier to maneuver in inaccessible buildings.
Walking up a ramp with assistance.
He asked that the press avoid photographing him walking, maneuvering, or being transferred from his car, a stipulation most members of the press respected, with the occasional journalist not honoring the request.
Looking out from a balcony.
For context, in the 1920s, in an ableist society where discrimination favors able-bodied people, those living with disability were stigmatized and deeply mistreated. Many were put in asylums and banished from their families. Society cast them aside. With this in mind, it wasn't surprising FDR downplayed his disability. At the same time, he used his experience as a way of connecting with the public. When visiting wounded World War II soldiers, he remained in his wheelchair.
A seated Roosevelt.
On a visit to Howard University, upon the request of the school president, the assembled student body watched FDR as he was lifted out of his car and walked slowly and painfully to the podium. He began the March of Dimes, an organization to combat polio. Many people recognized themselves in his story and struggles and looked to him for leadership and security during difficult times of the Great Depression and World War II. As FDR said,
"The only thing we have to fear is fear itself."
He drew courage and determination directly from his experience being disabled.
In a top hat with a dignitary.
FDR was encouraged to visit Warm Springs, Georgia, because the water there was reportedly therapeutic for paralyzed people.
FDR in a
He went
swimsuit.
there for the first time in 1924 and bought the property in 1926.
It was a place where disabled people could live openly with all the support needed to enjoy life. And enjoy life they did. From picnicking to putting on theatrical plays, it was considered one of the first experiences in the independent living movement. He was so involved, they even called him Doc Roosevelt.
After a 12-year presidency, the longest in history, in 1945, Roosevelt died at Warm Springs. The world mourned. How would his life and legacy be remembered by those inspired by him and generations to come?
Mourners line a road. Statue of Limitations. Emily Kitchen, friend of the FDR Memorial.
Shortly before his death in 1945, Roosevelt told a friend that if a memorial would be dedicated to him, he wanted it to be simple, no larger than his desk, and placed near the National Archives.
A DC map.
Roosevelt was clear in his wishes, but ultimately, who gets to decide how to memorialize a person? Who would be responsible for the memorial's fate? In honor of FDR's request, a small white granite block sits at that spot on Pennsylvania Avenue in D.C. But that didn't seem sufficient compared to the scale of other presidential monuments.
The Washington Monument. The Jefferson Memorial. Mount Rushmore.
A series of competitions for the design of a new memorial were held in the 50s and 60s, but none of the winning designs got off or on the ground.
Drawings and models.
In 1974, a memorial designed by landscape architect Larry Halprin was finally approved, and official plans for the memorial were put in place. It would take over 20 years for the design to be realized.
Engraving at the memorial.
A few years after the competition, the government said the memorial was too expensive and grand.
In 1992, Bill Clinton was elected president. He and First Lady Hillary Clinton admired FDR and his wife, Eleanor.
They pushed for the memorial, Congress approved funding, and private donations started rolling in.
Nyla Morton.
Meanwhile, in the decades prior, many people were protesting for civil rights, seeking equality and better representation in American life. In the 1970s, disability rights activists lobbied Congress and marched on Washington to include civil rights language for people with disabilities. March on Washington. Sound familiar?
A large protest.
The disability movement learned a lot from Martin Luther King Jr. and other Black civil rights activists.
Jesse Jackson, Rosa Parks, John Lewis.
The march led to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the first law in history protecting the civil rights of people living with disabilities. But between 1973 and 1977, no regulations were issued, which meant no changes. So disability advocates organized sit-ins at 8 Department of Health, Education, and Welfare original headquarters. The sit-ins were pivotal in getting additional regulations signed that push equality and integration forward. Thanks to this advocacy work, in 1975, the Individual with Disability Education Act, known as IDEA, passed, enabling all children and youth with disabilities to receive free public education at public expense.
Children in school grinning.
In 1990, the Capitol crawl took place. A group of people with disabilities crawled up the steps of the U.S. Capitol to demand the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, a law ensuring equal access of people with disabilities to employment opportunities and public accommodations. After decades of campaigning, lobbying, and crawling, the bill finally passed.
Senator Harkin signing.
By the time the memorial was ready to be built in the mid-1990s, the disability community was a well-organized front, no longer willing to be treated like second-class citizens.
A red X on the phrase.
While the ADA granted people living with disability greater access and opportunities legally, people living with disabilities still face a great deal of prejudice and bias, like stereotypical portrayals in the media, physical barriers to schools, housing, and voting stations, and a lack of affordable health care.
In the mid-1990s, news articles were published about plans for the memorial, and the general public became aware of it. Mike DeLand became chair of the board of directors for the National Organization on Disability, a nonprofit founded and led by Alan Reich. They read the news and noticed that FDR's disability wasn't shown in the memorial design.
Mike DeLand at a rally.
Mike was fired up. He started advocating for a depiction of FDR as a person with a disability, going to meetings and giving his opinion about creating a statue that showed FDR in a wheelchair. He was met with a resounding no.
Mike and Alan agreed they needed support. But who could take the fight to the next level?
Text, change in perspective. Emily Kitchen, friend of the FDR Memorial.
Enter Jim Dickson, an activist with a disability who was also a bit of a celebrity. Mike and Alan hired him to help the cause.
Nyla Morton.
In response to the outrage, the committee said, "You have to be blind to go through the memorial and not know Roosevelt was disabled." This only intensified disability activists' outrage, some of whom, like Jim, were blind. It became their mission to uphold Roosevelt's legacy, accurately depicting him as he lived, with a disability.
FDR in a wheelchair.
This wasn't Jim's first rodeo. He single-handedly sailed to Bermuda to display what disabled people can do. He and fellow activists once carried a coffin into the D.C. Metro headquarters to protest the lack of safety for blind people in the D.C. public transportation system.
Protest signs.
He helped escalate the fight. Around this time, Christopher Reeve, an actor who played Superman, had a horseback riding accident and became a wheelchair user.
Reeve in his wheelchair.
Because he was a huge star, it wasn't surprising he met with the Clintons. He let them know he thought it was important that FDR should be shown with a disability in the memorial.
Thank you very much for taking the time to see us. Really appreciate it.
In May 1996, President Clinton gave a speech and said,
"Just last week, I had a very moving visit with Christopher Reeve in the Oval Office. And I mentioned to Christopher that in 1933, the Oval Office was the first government office designed specifically to be accessible, to accommodate President Roosevelt. He said to me that it was too bad that at the time he had to hide his disability. I hope with Christopher Reeve that as the Roosevelt Memorial becomes a reality, with your efforts to remove the stigma of disability, they'll find a way to make sure that the American people know that this great, great president was great with his disability."
A typewritten letter.
16 of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's grandchildren also issued a letter saying they believed their grandfather would want to be shown with a disability in his memorial.
Meanwhile, Jim, Alan, and Mike mobilized 50 disability organizations, independent advocates, journalists, politicians, and former presidents.
Social activism confronted power structures. From street protests to bake sale fundraising, momentum was building. In reference to FDR's disability, Eleanor once said, "It gave him strength and courage he had not had before. He had to think out the fundamentals of living and learn the greatest of all lessons: infinite patience and never-ending persistence." This same relentless patience and persistence fueled people living with disabilities' fight for representation and justice.
The Park Service logo.
During one of Jim's meetings with the National Park Service, someone slipped him a piece of paper. When he got back to his office, his assistant read it to him. It said to call a phone number. A voice on the other line told him about an upcoming reception in upstate New York where artwork for the memorial was going to be revealed.
Memorial protested.
Jim got in touch with disability leaders in the area, and they staged a protest, interrupting the event. An unexpected, disruptive scene, the protest sent a powerful message. It was April 15th, and the memorial was going to be dedicated on May 2nd. The disability community across the country was activated. But time was running out.
With only days left before the dedication,
President Clinton invited Jim and other activists to the White House
and told them he was going to call for legislation to add a depiction of FDR in his wheelchair.
The legislation passed in the Senate a day before the memorial's opening, passing smoothly in the House of Representatives. It became official. A new statue would be added. Protests quickly turned into a celebration and victory for people living with disabilities.
But first, in 1997, the original statue of FDR was unveiled as a part of an elaborate, star-studded memorial dedication in D.C.'s Tidal Basin. President Clinton led the dedication.
Today, we honor the greatest president of this great American century.
The original statue showed Roosevelt cloaked head to toe, sitting in what looks like a regular chair. But a new statue would be added. It just needed to be funded, to the tune of $1.65 million. Donations came in from people across the country, disabled and able-bodied alike.
FDR wheelchair statue.
On January 10, 2001, a new statue of FDR was unveiled and dedicated by President Clinton in the memorial. FDR wheelchair is visible, marking the end of a 6-year fight by disability advocacy groups to memorialize the president as he lived, showcasing his disability as a point of pride.
Mike DeLand.
School children who will visit this memorial will know that FDR led this nation and the world from his wheelchair. They will know that in America, anything is possible.
Designed by sculptor Robert Graham, the life-size statue sits on the ground, not on a pedestal, removed from the walls so people can gather and move around it with full accessibility.
Children surround the statue.
Instead of a giant figure looming from above, the 3 million people who visit annually can now get a sense of Roosevelt's perspective, seeing the world from where he sat.
The fight for representation, healthcare, and accessibility for people living with disability is far from over. But tireless advocates continue to make progress, including the FDR Memorial Correction. While plenty of monuments can't stand the test of time, this memorial adapted. 2 statues in one space capture the duality of how FDR lived. Finally, it's a place where anyone with a disability can see themselves.
Braille signage.
An empowering reminder of what's possible and hopefully what's to come.
In memory of the disabled advocates and allies who fought for disability rights and representation, video produced by the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee. This project has been funded by National Trust for Historic Preservation's Telling the Full History Preservation Fund, with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Gordon and Laura Gund Foundation. Special thanks to all the donors who made the FDR wheelchair statue a reality, especially Judy and Peter Blum Kovler Foundation, the Gordon and Laura Gund Foundation. Thank you to our narrators, Nyla Morton and Emily Kitchen. A smiling Nyla uses a wheelchair. Executive producer Ben Patterson, Onslaught Films. Nyla makes the V sign with 2 fingers.
Well, I hope you liked that. And that's just to tee up this wonderful panel. And as the panelists come on up, I'm going to introduce Dr. Max Friedman. Max Paul Friedman is a professor and chair in the Department of History at American U. His first book was about the Roosevelt administration's foreign policy. and he teaches courses covering the New Deal and the Second World War. And again, I just want to thank you, Dr. Friedman, for endorsing this concept and backing this project, and thank you for being here and moderating this discussion.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you for all the cooperation, all of the participants who spent much of this year planning for and bringing about this event for such an important milestone. It's wonderful to be at a celebratory gathering. There's not a lot of happy history out there, and sometimes we find ourselves in commemorations that are about grieving or understanding better some of the crimes of the past, and in this case, it is about how people, when they come together, can indeed overcome. And I'm just going to say a few words before I turn it over to the panel that we have today. And what I wanted to say is that there's a myth out there that refuses to die. You've heard it before. You might be forgiven for thinking that Christopher Reeves just repeated it in the film. The myth says that Roosevelt was ashamed of his disability and conspired with the press to hide it from the American people. That myth is worth less than 10 cents. If you have a dime in your pocket, but who has cash these days, you would see that Roosevelt's face has been on the dime, and it's been on the dime since 1946, the year after his death. And the reason he's on the dime is that it was chosen to honor his leadership in the March of Dimes. And in case that went by a little quickly in the film, that organization was founded to raise money for research into polio and to help those who survived it. And the name came from asking Americans to send a dime to the White House to help fund research that could defeat the disease. And millions of them responded to his call. Moreover, in every year of his presidency, FDR also helped organize events across the country on his birthday, known as the birthday balls, which were parties designed to raise money to put together hundreds of millions of dollars for polio research. In fact, through Roosevelt's efforts in those organizations, this was the source of the funding that allowed Dr. Jonas Salk to ultimately come up with the vaccine for which he received a Nobel Prize in medicine, and which eliminated one of the most feared diseases of the 20th century. So it's absurd to say that FDR concealed his disability. He made it a national cause. What is true, the film used the word downplay. I think that's pretty fair. He wanted to manage the narrative about it. He preferred not to be photographed in a way that he feared might convey weakness, especially because the country was in a hell of a shape with people facing terrifying economic circumstances, and then were involved in a global war. Instead, he wanted people to understand polio as he understood it, which is this was an experience that should be understood as a sign of strength, of resilience, of having overcome and learned from this challenge. And as Helena said, it also deepened his natural empathy. If you have ever wondered, how could somebody born into so much wealth have so much understanding and compassion for Americans struggling through the Great Depression or whatever other obstacles they faced? Well, living with polio is part of the answer. So let me conclude with just one small anecdote. There's a scene in the film that I'd like to contextualize. On a visit to Hawaii in 1944, Roosevelt was inspecting military hospitals. And he said, "Take me to the amputee ward," and had himself quite deliberately wheeled before the young sailors and soldiers lying in their beds and sitting in chairs, so they could gaze upon his shattered legs and think, maybe I have a meaningful life ahead of me too. That was how Roosevelt tried to steer the understanding of his disability, and one way we might remember it today. Well, with that, let me introduce our panel. I'll tell you who everyone is before we start with hearing from them individually. Jim Dickson, whom we met in the film, is a longtime disability rights advocate. He served as vice president of the American Association of People with Disabilities, and as we've seen, led the grassroots campaign for the FDR wheelchair statue. In 1987, he made that solo trip on a sailboat from Rhode Island to Bermuda to highlight the abilities of people with disabilities. Nyla Morton is the narrator of the documentary we've just seen and is youth coordinator for Advocates for Justice and Education. She is a highly regarded disability activist and a social media influencer. A licensed social worker in Maryland, Nyla earned a Master's of Social Work from Howard University. Katie Greenstein is an alum of American University's Public History Master's Program, specializing in disability history. Katie has been a facilitator for the National Council of Public History's Disability and Accessibility Working Group, and they now work in partnerships and volunteers at the National Park Service. Professor Mary Ellen Curtin is a historian in AU's American Studies program. She has taught and published on poverty, incarceration, Washington, D.C., and African American and women's social and political history. Her latest book on Barbara Jordan's life and legacy in Black politics examines the impact of the first Black woman from the South elected to Congress. And she's at work on a new book about how Jordan, Franklin Roosevelt, and others have negotiated their disabilities in the U.S. political system. So let me turn, Jim, to you first. You played a leadership role in launching this successful effort. Why did you decide to take this up of all possible struggles?
When I was 7, I and my parents brought me to see our family doctor, Thomas Kelly. And he said to me, "Jim, you're going to go blind, but that's not the problem. The problem is that for the rest of your life, people are going to say you can do this and you can't do that. But Jim, you're no different than me or your parents. The only way you can find out if you can do something is to try. And sometimes you'll fail, and sometimes you'll succeed." And as we were walking home, my mother said to me, "You know, President Roosevelt used a wheelchair. And if he can be president from a wheelchair, you can do anything you're willing to work hard enough for." So when I was asked by Alan Reich to organize the grassroots, I was delighted to say yes, because it was not only an opportunity to thank Roosevelt, but to also thank my parents and Dr. Kelly.
Thank you, Jim, for getting us started with that very poignant story. Nyla, if I could turn to you, why does someone your age care so much about a long-dead president in a wheelchair when there are a lot of other struggles going on in your life and at the time of your involvement and today?
Yes, so I feel like it's very important because one of the things that I always advocate about is helping people see that disabled people are people. And one of the most important things is representation. So when I was asked to narrate this story, I was like, yes. And it's funny because a long time ago, my mom told me about FDR, that he was in a wheelchair. And it was like along the same lines of, hey, yes, you are disabled, and yes, there's going to be challenges, and yes, you're going to fail a lot of times, but it's okay because all it means is you have to keep, get up and keep trying. And also finding out different ways that works. And I feel like with FDR, with him being president, he just had to find a way to be president with a disability and how he wanted to show up and show people that, yes, there are challenges, but it doesn't mean it's impossible.
Thank you, Nyla. And if I could turn to you, Katie, as a historian formed right here on the AU campus, how have the portrayal of FDR and his disability evolved in commemoration over the years, for example, at his historic home or at Warm Springs or right here in town?
Yeah, I think I'll speak just to DC. I think that's a little bit easier. Maybe speak to some of the places that folks here could have easily been today, for example. I'll start by saying that I am not speaking here as a representative necessarily of my employer, the Park Service, but that I'm just bringing some expertise that I know from working there. The video also hinted at both of the representations of FDR that you can find as memorials. And I think one of the interesting things that it hinted at is that FDR really wanted his memorial to be small, to be spare, to be simple, and to be about the size of his desk. There's a plaque outside of that memorial that has that quote that says that it should be simple. And it really is just a white marble block with his birth date, his death date, and the dates of his presidency on it and his name. And that stone is really just there to remind people of who he was. And its location is really just there to reflect his respect for the institution and the founding documents of the country. So kind of in contrast to that, that original memorial was created in the 1960s. And immediately after that, the folks the folks interested in the tidal basin location started to create that larger memorial that we all know and love. But interestingly, that's not what FDR himself would have wanted. It includes 4 fully accessible rooms, the big difference there being that you can go inside of it. That also includes the prologue room, which has the wheelchair statue. And it honors not just who FDR was, but also what he did. It talks about policy. It's got visual imagery. There's not just one statue, but 2. And so there's kind of a lot going on there. Its location, unlike the National Archives, is on the tidal basin to hint at not just the fluidity and adaptability of FDR's presidency, but also the hydrotherapy that he used at Warm Springs to support him during his presidency and beyond it for his disability. So I really think there's kind of a lot going on at the tidal basin location, and it came a lot later. And I think kind of the distance from FDR's presidency himself and his time being alive kind of pulls away from his wishes, which I think is the nature of memorialization sometimes. So yeah, I think they're both very interesting locations. I'd be really interested to hear what folks at other national park sites that reflect FDR or at Warm Springs, which is a state park, would also think about that. But those are my thoughts about the 2 sites we've got here in DC.
Well, thank you, Katie. And if I could turn to you, Mary Ellen, you've studied political strategies around disability as well as commemoration of politicians with disabilities. Why don't you share some of what you found?
Thank you, Max. Yes, I came to this through studying a different politician. That was Barbara Jordan of Texas, the first Black woman from the South to be elected to Congress. And I have some slides of her. But it just struck me, studying her life, how, as Max said, she had to negotiate and her disability and control the narrative. And I think that's the most important thing, because especially as a person in politics and as a Black woman in politics, it was very important to her to have credibility and not to be undermined by any suggestion of weakness. And this is something all politicians deal with. You know, there's very few people willing to disclose anything about their health, right? Let alone a disability such as hers. And so it was not common at all for people to disclose a cancer diagnosis or an MS diagnosis or anything of that sort. And so when she, for example, gave her amazing address in 1976 of a national televised audience, she really could not, she needed mobility assistance. She could not walk down the aisle, you know, of Madison Square Garden as some of her supporters wanted her to. Nevertheless, she was determined to give a speech that would unite the nation, and it did. It's gone down in history as one of the greatest speeches in American history. And so subsequent to that, you know, whenever anyone would ask her, she would talk about a bum knee, or she would be very defensive and say, my body is my own. You know, it's not your business. But then gradually she appeared everywhere in all of her public appearances, including at the Democratic National Convention in a wheelchair. So to me, I would like to say, though, that the struggle for positive public depictions of people, and particularly our political leaders with disabilities, continues, because in Texas, when I wanted to show you some of this, there's a reluctance, let me just put it this way, and I can show you this. There's a reluctance to depict her in her wheelchair. But I did want to draw your attention to a current exhibit at the FDR Memorial called First Things First, Disability, FDR, and Access. And if you've never had the chance to go to Hyde Park, I just wanted to show you some of what you would see. So this is the house called Springwood. This is where FDR grew up. Now, it wasn't this house exactly. Those two wings, it was a more modest house than this. Those two wings were added on in 1914. But this is the house, it was his father's house and the house where he grew up. There's usually a ramp in the front. You're supposed to hold this. Oh, thank you. There's usually a ramp in the front that he used. And there was a ramp down to the sitting room. And this, I believe, was also used by FDR's father, who had a heart condition and was in a wheelchair. So Roosevelt was not, he was used to seeing people in wheelchairs, and this house accommodated people in wheelchairs. But his father was not particularly active. But FDR was, and this is the thing that you really get from when you go and visit this house, that he was a person of action, a politician of action, a person with an incredible array of interests. He collected art, particularly naval prints. He collected books. He was an avid hunter as a youth of birds of the Hudson Valley. And he was an enthusiastic taxidermist. So you see evidence of all of these interests of his in the house as you visit. And again, his mobility devices are there because he used them. They were not used as a part of an illness. They were used for him to get around. And this is very clear wherever you are, whether you're upstairs, downstairs, and this is part of the sitting room. And there was an elevator in the house, and the elevator was there for his father originally, and he didn't want to change it. So this was operated by a pulley, and he used it and to move around the house and to go up and down. He could do it himself, but he often had help within the house. So whenever you see, there's many pictures I could show of visitors coming to the house, family in the house. As Max was saying, there was no hiding his use of a wheelchair or his disability throughout his life or in his home. And you see his mobility device in his bedroom, which again was just part of his routine. And so I think the house itself does a pretty good job of just showing daily life, and how he got around and used his mobility devices to further his interests, but also his work. And he did work. This was the first presidential library, and there was a path, and he designed this himself. So the path from Springwood to his archive in his office was very purposely laid out. So this is the path he would have taken in his wheelchair from his home to his office on these grounds. And now if you go, you'll see, have the ability to see a brand new exhibit called First Things First, FDR Disability and Access. And I just wanted to point out a few things about this exhibit, which takes the depiction of disability here in DC, I think, to a new level. It emphasizes that FDR changed our perceptions of disability. His wheelchair was not to be an invalid, as it was for his father. It was to be an instrument for his mobility. And you can see these different depictions of wheelchairs and also his innovative spirit. He created his own wheelchair. He also created the devices on his car. He could drive his own car because he designed the accelerator and the brakes to be handheld, and you can see the car at this exhibit. Also, the disability, the exhibit itself is created with accessibility in mind. So you have dual displays. So the pictures on the wall are the same as the pictures on the exhibit. So people visiting this in wheelchairs or with other disabilities are not straining to see anything. So all of the best practices recommended by the Smithsonian are taken into account. Everything is in sans serif typeface, quotes from Roosevelt. So again, this is also taking best practices into account. And you have 3D, not only accessible displays, but displays that are meant to be touchable. So again, this is a great innovation. You don't see this in very many museums at all, but all of these innovations, I think, bring knowledge about Roosevelt as a person, not just as a powerful leader, but just as a person, to the forefront and make his life accessible to all.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. Nyla, if I could return to you. You know, I was struck in the film that you referred, of course, to the civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter protests after the murder of George Floyd. And I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit of your thoughts on intersectional connections in the movements you've been involved in for justice, as well as some of the challenges that they have confronted.
Oh, yes. So I want people to really understand that, first, let me talk about the civil rights movement. A lot of the disability movement will talk about how they was able to learn their tactics and their strategies from the civil rights movement. A lot of the time, people don't really think the intersectionality of race and disability tend, to go together a lot of the time, because unfortunately, race is very disabling. Racism is very disabling. A lot of it's just going back in slavery. There are a lot of Black disabled people that exist, but unfortunately, in history, they erase it. But the truth is, they did exist. They may not have been documented because most of the time, if someone was disabled, they would either be harmed, killed, or they would be sold off. So they existed, never existed. Something I always love to talk about, especially during Black History Month, is all the Black leaders who have a disability. Someone I really talk about a lot is Harriet Tubman. A lot of people do not know she had epilepsy. Yes, epilepsy. And so she would fall asleep. And most of the time when she would fall asleep, she actually used her disability as a way to help her guide through helping people who was enslaved to become free. She felt like her disability was a way to connect with God that helped guide her. And so I always thought that was beautiful, because a lot of the times when people hear about disabilities, they always think of something as a weakness. But for Harriet Tubman, it was her strength. It was her way to help. And so when it comes to the disability movement, it's always a lot of ties right back to the civil rights movements, or even movements beyond, when it comes to making sure that we advocate for Black people to have rights, even now. But there is a lot of things that the disability movement have learned from other movements, so they can be able to fight for disability rights. And I always thought that was beautiful. Even now, I do that, especially when I talk about disability. I always make sure to talk about Black disabled people, to make sure that we are seen and we are heard. I feel like that's very important, even now with everything that's going on. If we're going to fight for disability rights, we have to make sure it's inclusive to everybody, not just for a specific group of people.
Thank you, Nyla. Jim, if I might ask you, would you like to use this opportunity to tell us a little bit more, to dish on some of the opposition that you encountered, which the film alludes to, but there aren't a whole lot of war stories in there. And having followed the story at that time pretty closely, I was kind of shocked at the initial response that you and your movement encountered.
Yeah. There was an office for the memorial up in one of the Senate office buildings. And when disability groups would come to town, a group of us would go up to try to talk to the staff for the memorial. They heard us coming because we we would be chanting or singing, like the Civil Rights Movement. And every time they slammed the door, wouldn't talk to us. We would write notes. People would tell their story. We'd slip it under the door. This particular day, surprise, surprise, the police came and said, well, you got to leave or we're going to arrest you. And we had talked about that. We did not want to get arrested because then the story is people with disabilities get arrested. That's the headline, as opposed to people with disabilities demand to see FDR in a wheelchair. We're walking out of the building, and Senator Inouye, a great American, who was chair of the commission, walked past us. And one of the people recognized him and said, Senator, can we just talk to you? And so we did. And I asked the folks in the wheelchair to just take 2 minutes and explain why, as a person who used a wheelchair, it was important to see FDR statue show the wheelchair. People spoke. A couple people cried. Senator Inouye only had one arm. He lost it in combat during World War II. And he had said on many occasions, if they make a statue of me, I want them to show me with 2 arms. But he listened to each person. There were 6 people. There were about 15 of us, 6 in wheelchairs, and they all did their 2 minutes. He didn't say a word, but he did turn to face each person as she or he spoke. And then we left. And, you know, much to his credit, Senator Inouye did a 180 turn in terms of his policy and eventually said, yes, I think there should be a statue that shows him in the wheelchair. There aren't a lot of politicians who will reverse a long-held public position, but he did it with grace, but it was the one-on-one storytelling that I think really moved him.
Thank you, Jim. That certainly has been my experience in studying social movements, that the power of storytelling can't be understated. And speaking of the power of storytelling, Mary Ellen, if I might follow up with, you started to tell us a little bit about how Barbara Jordan has been commemorated and is remembered in Texas. I wondered if you might like to pick that up.
Yeah, thank you, Max. Let's see if I can. Oh, this one. Okay. You know, after she retired from Congress in 1978, Barbara Jordan lived for another almost 20 years. She died in 1996 at the age of 59. And during those 20 years, she led a very active public life. And she taught at the University of Texas at Austin. She was involved in Ann Richards' gubernatorial campaign, very much so, very publicly. She hosted hundreds of parties at her home that she shared with her partner, Nancy Earle. They invited students and colleagues. And she loved going out, particularly to events sponsored by her good friend, Lady Bird Johnson, who you can see there in the pink gown on the right. And if you don't recognize the woman in blue, that's the Queen of England, alongside Anne Richards. She was a very private person, but at the same time, a person who loved life and who loved being in the stream of life and who loved contributing to public life. President Clinton nominated her to serve as chair of a bipartisan committee on immigration. And she served on that committee for years and years. It was a hard-fought battle. Unfortunately, their recommendations, she was set to testify on the week she died. So it was something she was dedicated to for the remainder of her life. And as part of that commission, they traveled all over the U.S. to talk to people. They went to border communities. They went to Mexico. They went to South Africa. And many of the places they went to were not accessible. So there's one memorable story where in Mexico, literally 4 strong men carried her in her wheelchair up the steps of the presidential palace. She was not expecting that because they said everywhere we went, we tried to make sure there was accessibility. And they said, oh, yeah, we have these guys here who are going to carry you. I mean, this was not comfortable. But, you know, as part of her service, she did this. And she did this all with great style and authority. But this is how she's depicted at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the story of this statue. When there was a contest to see how Barbara Jordan was going to be depicted, and they had a sculptor by the name of Kim Crowley who showed Jordan sitting on a bench. Now, she was not in a wheelchair, but she was sitting. And his vision of her was to depict somebody in a sort of thoughtful pose. And he said, you know, his sitting piece, was aimed at connecting with the student body. He said, the campus already has other overblown, oversized statues. Sculpturally, that's kind of unsophisticated. And students actually chose the sitting Jordan. They liked that. But it was deemed by the committee as unheroic, with one dean stating that there was a need, quote, to look further and find a design that people could walk up to and be in awe. The sitting Jordan was then removed, and the public embraced the vertical Jordan, which was readily understood as a symbol of power and strength, standing like she stood up for the Constitution. So clearly we still have a terrible, people cannot think about disability and leadership, disability and courage in a way that is, and depicted in a way that is universally understood. But I think Jordan herself, it's not clear really how she would have liked to have been depicted, because I think she was an activist to the end. She certainly was never shy about being photographed. This is a very famous photograph of her that appeared in an anthology of Black women. And I think that as an activist, you know, somebody who was always standing up for people's rights, she was comfortable in her wheelchair in public and as a person who wielded power and authority from it to the end of her life. So, you know, as much as the FDR Memorial is so important and led the way, I think we need to pursue this and recognize our other public figures in the same way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. Katie, if I could turn to you again. The wheelchair statue fight was successful. What are the burning issues today for young people, students organizing around disability?
Yeah, I will say I graduated in December, and it feels like it was a very long time ago. So I'm not totally sure what has happened in the past 3 months in terms of burning issues with students. Every time I talk to a current student, it feels like there's something new. But I will say that the issues that faced me when I was a student here, and that faced me when I was a student in high school, and that faced me when I was a student in middle school and elementary school, and have always been, much like many of the other panelists have kind of alluded to, questions of representation in some form or another. For example, disability previously to my education here was not included in panels on disability and diversity. They weren't included in things like Welcome Week or affinity graduation celebrations, or various other kinds of diversity panels. Disability was not part of that. And I found that to be pretty unsatisfying when I showed up. And so when I showed up to university, I was part of the group that founded the Disabled Student Union here. Shout out if you're part of that. And so part of that was because we found it pretty difficult to not have a place to just like sit around and be disabled together, and also sometimes complain about how hard it is to be in university, but also to have a visible community and culture that could be recognized together as part of diversity. And so it has taken a while. I'm very glad that now the university sees us as a part of that kind of diverse panel, and we can be included in events like Welcome Week. Shout out to the Office of Inclusive Excellence for seeing that. Dr. Friday and I have a good collaborative relationship now. And we have things like Welcome Week. We had an affinity graduation, which happened in 2025, which was awesome. But we weren't able to have that forever. And so at the beginning of my university career, we did not have those things. So part of DSU's founding was about representation in the literal sense, like being seen on campus together, and making that space, finding ourselves getting covered in university newspapers, co-hosting events with organizations that did find themselves represented. So a lot of intersectional organizing, kind of like Nyla was referencing, a lot of work with the Black Student Union, with AU Pride, various other organizations that find themselves with large disabled populations within them, and working to host events that showed our communities in lots of different lights. The other way that representation found themselves when I was a student here was in policy. And this is getting kind of nerdy, but the example I'll give is with a 504 coordinator. Under Section 504, universities are required to have one. And throughout my entire college career, so 5.5 years, we didn't have one, which stinks. Shout out to Stephanie, who has since been hired, but she didn't exist until after I left. And so over 4 years of a typical college career, she did not exist. And for several years before that, AU did not have a 504 coordinator. It took several years after we started asking for AU to hire one, and I'm not exactly sure why. That is bad news, so sorry to be a downer, Max, on your celebration. But why did we go through all of this effort to found a student organization, to found a graduate student wing of a student organization, to make protests, to host events, to, sometimes raise money for mutual aid, to have a faculty advisor, sometimes multiple, and to do all of this stuff? And the answer is because students still win. Student organizations are an incredibly powerful force on a college campus. They are the force on a college campus. Students are the customers here. And the phrase "the customer" is always right. Sometimes takes a while, but it is true. And they are the force for change in places like this. When you want progress, students are the people you need to talk to. And now I'm about to start a PhD, and I still believe that. Students are the people to talk to. When I was a TA, my students were like always right, and I still believe that, and reading their papers was awesome. Students are a force for change. And so those were the issues when I was a student. I've been not a student for 3 months. I would love to hear from students in the reception about what's been facing them now, because I would love to help them. And I'm excited to become a student again in August and hear more about becoming involved in their issues on their campus. So yeah, I'm excited.
Thank you, Katie. I think we have time for one more roundup here on the panel, and we'll open it up to questions and comments from the audience. If I could come back to Nyla, Can you tell us more about your own practice of supporting children, youth, and adults with visible and invisible disabilities in your therapeutic practice?
Oh, yes, I can. So I am youth coordinator at Advocates for Justice and Education. And so what I do there is I run a program called the Youth Advisory Board, which I have been working on for a very long time, but it started up this month. And what's the whole point of the program is to help students with disability from age 14 to 22 to be able to gain leadership development skills as well as advocacy skills. Something that we learned is that in the DC State Board of Education, there's not a lot of representation when it comes to students with disabilities. And we felt like it would be a great idea to help them develop those skills, so just in case one day they may want to be that representation. But also it was to help us to have insight on what's going on, because the whole point of the organization that we have is that most of the time we hear from parents about what's going on in the schools, especially with a child who have a disability, but we never really hear from the child and how they feel and what they feel like is a main issue. So we felt like this would be a great way to interact with the students. But not only that, but also to help them be able to see each other, have their peers, be around their peers, and also to know that it's possible. And I do feel like with me being the lead of that program, they can actually see me and see that I am someone who have overcome so many barriers, who have overcome a lot just to be where I'm at. I mean, I'm from South Carolina, and one day I told my mom, I said, I'm going to live in D.C., and honestly, she was the reason why I'm here. So, yes, please clap for her because I'm here. I applied to grad school at Howard, and I got in, and I was like, and I told my mom, I said, I'm going to D.C. I was scared. I was nervous because with me being disabled, I didn't know what to expect, but I did it. I graduated. I got a job. I actually got 2 jobs now. I'm a youth coordinator, and I am a mental health therapist. And so I always try to use my experience in my job, especially now with me being a youth coordinator, to show people that, yes, there are going to be challenges, especially with me having to deal with a lot of discrimination, not only because I'm disabled, but I am a Black woman. But I always try to show people that, yes, it's okay that you're going to go through challenges, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. Like, anything is possible, especially with support, depending on your faith, you know, God, the universe, or whoever. But also I feel like it's very important to be a representation because there's not a lot of representation when it comes to disabilities, especially in the work field. And so that's what I always try to advocate for my students whenever I'm in a program. Like, hey, this is who is working in this field. They have a disability, and just so they can know it's possible.
Thank you, Nara. Mary Ellen, President Trump recently said that California Governor Gavin Newsom should not be president because he has dyslexia, which makes me want to ask you, from your given your historical perspective, what has changed in the American political system and what has not changed over time around this issue?
Oh, my God. Well, oh, my goodness. I mean, talk about like 10 steps backward, 1 step forward, 10 steps backward. I mean, I just think President Trump has made insults like that acceptable, you know, which is a backward thing, very backward. So he's given a green light to hate so many people.
Yep.
And I think that is a change. I don't, you know, there's silence. But then there's outspoken hate. And to have, again, symbolism is important. If the president say these things is not a joke. It sends a message, it sends a green light, and it makes it seemingly acceptable, and it's amplified because we have because of social media. I'm not saying anything people here don't already know. And I think this also calls on all of us to step up. To denounce these kinds of statements because they may seem, you know, there's so many horrible things happening. It's hard to know. This is thing like flooding the field, right? With so many different kinds of statements of hate. It's hard to know how to prioritize, and we all feel overwhelmed. But I do think that permission to hate is a change, and one that must be called out and combated.
Well, in that case, let me turn to Jim as a movement veteran. What is your advice to young people who want to make a difference through activism?
Vote early and often. I think there's going to be an election in November. And I actually think that there'll be a blue wave. I'm pretty confident the Democrats, who aren't all that great, will be there, and that'll be a check, and hopefully they will start to say what you just said, that it is wrong to hate. But find a candidate in the primaries. If I was put up against the wall and told, you can't vote in the general election, I would not be that upset, because I'd be furious if I was told the same thing about the primary. The primaries shape the debate. The primaries pick the candidate, and a national disgrace is that so few people vote in the primaries. A big deal is a fifth of the registered voters vote in primaries. You find a candidate and volunteer for that candidate, or you run as a candidate, because the primaries shape the debate. The primaries will determine if there are going to be candidates who are going to stand up and say it is wrong to hate, it is un-American to hate. That has to start in the primaries. If it's not said in the primaries, it's not going to be said in the general election.
Thank you, Jim. Katie, I'd like to bring us back around to the commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the successful struggle for the wheelchair statue. As somebody who has studied the field of public history and now has entered it and is a practitioner as well, what are your thoughts on how we commemorate important people and important aspects of the past, and who commemoration is for, who gets to make those choices, and what else you've learned now that you've also been living and working in the space of public commemoration?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start by defining public history. I think the first question when I say that I'm a public historian is most often, well, what is that? Public history is the field of history that works by, for, and about the public. So as a public historian, most often I don't do presidential history. It is a little atypical for me to be doing this. I usually like doing history that's about like normal people. And presidents are kind of not that. They're kind of not normal. And so I guess the first thing that I'd say is what I've learned is that presidents are not normal. And they are often commemorated in ways that are also really weird. Presidential memorials are quite strange. And we treat them in ways that are quite strange. The fact that we have entire organizations for memorials for presidents is really weird. Any other person would typically not have this. The fact that I'm here is quite strange versus any other average human. And so as a public historian, I think like reflecting on the work that I do, I was speaking a couple months ago in MJ's class, one of our public history professors here, and we were talking to some undergraduates about what public history is and how we do it. And I was reflecting and I was like, am I doing public history right now? Not so sure. I think in terms of commemorating, and how we do commemoration and what I can learn from commemoration as an early career public history practitioner. The FDR Memorial is a really cool case study because the memorial itself is accessible, and we're doing a lot of like ethics of public history in this setting. Public history is not just about the public, it's also by and for the public. Memorials are a great example. They are for the public. Lots of people use the memorial as a space to eat lunch. They use it to walk their dog. They use it to go, right now, look at the cherry blossoms. It is a space that is not just about people who want to learn about FDR. It is also just like a recreational space. So it's also an effort of learning about people using things, not just how you intend them, but also how they're going to use them. And it's also collaborative. Public history is very much about making things accessible. It's about making things collaborative. It's about working with partners who won't always get along with every single person in every single room, or you won't always get along with every single person in every single room, but you still have to work together regardless. And so I think a lot about public history for me and working in this particular job and doing things with the FDR Memorial has been trying to act as a bridge in my position and trying to bring people together, focus on accessibility, and really trying to live the public history ethos that I learned here at AU, because I really do want to focus on preserving the disability element of the FDR Memorial, but also just this beautiful recreation space that's currently a little bit under construction because we're fixing some fountains, but it will be beautiful come, the rest of the season, and we'll get to enjoy it for hopefully many, many, many years to come.
Thank you, Katie. I'd like to open the floor to the audience if you have questions for the panelists or would like to make a comment. Yes, please. Here's one. Oh, there it comes.
For access, I was waiting for the microphone. My name is Lee Sin-jen Chung-Sun Brown. I'm an adjunct here at AU and longtime involved in disability organizing and disability policy work. And Jim, to your point, I am running for Maryland State Legislature this year. So anyone that is interested in talking to me about that, please come hunt me down. My campaign team tells me I have to talk to people about it constantly, but I have an actual question for you. My question goes to something that you actually had raised earlier, and it is we're talking about the importance of a memorial that represents a visibly and known disabled person and why that's relevant now in creating what I've heard called in some communities a possibility model, that it is possible for disabled people to exist in many spaces. And from the left, we might also think about the history of US presidents and war crimes, and I'm like, well, it's also possible for people with disabilities to be great achievers, to be achievers in social welfare, in social justice, and people with disabilities today and in the past have not always done those things. But then I'm thinking about, very particularly, where we are now in a state of heightened eugenicist rhetoric from not just the current administration, but also Congress, also at the state level. We just heard today the Supreme Court issued a decision striking down the Colorado law that banned conversion therapy for LGBTQ minors. And as we're gearing up for election season this year, I hear from both the left and the right, from both political parties, consistently ableist narratives that people with disabilities should not be in power. This is not just from, and Mary Ellen, you spoke to this, President Trump, and in his 2016 campaign and onward, insulting and spewing hatred toward disabled people and other marginalized groups, but it also comes from the left wing, who are today making commentary and jokes and insults about Trump that are based upon his body, that are based upon assuming he has an intellectual disability or a mental health disability or some kind of chronic illness, whether or not he actually does, instead of focusing on the eugenicist social policies that our country's enacting now, like nearly $1 trillion of cuts to Medicaid, the largest cuts in history, that will leave many disabled people to die. So my question for the panel is, how can we as scholars and activists who care about educating the public and who care about shifting narratives about disability seek to fully humanize disabled people's experiences and roles in history and resist this type of ableist political discourse no matter where it comes from.
Yeah, thank you for running. What's your website so I can contribute?
Come find me and I'll give it to you.
Oh, give it to the group.
It is at brownformaryland.com. All the words are written out.
Brownformaryland.com. Brownformaryland.com.
I think everybody here has been in a group, family, friends, students, talking about Trump. And when somebody says, you know, he's an idiot, he's a fat slob, you gotta say, stop it. You can oppose his policies, but it is ableist, and I think it's very important that we have that word. You can accuse people of racism or sexism, and the day will come again when it's wrong to do that. As a community, we need the ableist label as one word to say it is wrong. And I've been doing that with people, and it's actually kind of fun because you get a reaction. Very often, the reaction is a shocked silence. And that's a good thing because it usually means people are thinking, or it can mean that.
Thank you. We had a question on the end, then we'll come to the front row.
Hello, my name is Robert. Hold on one second. I used to work for a U.S. Senator for ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And right now, this is the reason we have live interpreters and captions.
Thomas Edison had invented the light bulb, and I wanted to show you something here about him as well. See this, but he was deaf, actually, and I know that a lot of people don't know that. But anyway, I just thought that it would be an interesting little tidbit of information for you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Could we have the mic in the front row?
Thank you. I have two historical questions that I've been interested in. Number one is, where do you stand on the myasthenia gravis versus polio diagnosis of President FDR? I've heard recently that there's some debate about that. I'm just curious. And number two, could you say anything about Eleanor Roosevelt's reaction or how she dealt with the president? What was her interaction with him? What was her attitude about his disability? Was she a factor that was encouraging or some other kind of impact on how FDR really managed in his daily life?
Want to take that?
Yep. All right. Well, you can too, but, well, I don't know what, I think that is an interesting question perhaps, but I just know that his identity, he identified as a polio. And one of his great joys in life was creating community for other polios. And if it was a very prescient community that he created at Warm Springs because it was a place where people had fun, where there was a purposeful commitment to having fun. He went back there every Thanksgiving to break bread with others in his community. He wanted people to play games, to swim, to have picnics, to enjoy life. Yes, it was a place where he wanted to, quote unquote, get better. All right, so that's true. You know, he did want to improve his walking and his mobility. But I don't think, as the quotes in the exhibit say at Warm Springs, you know, the whole idea was to embrace your full humanity and not to be shut away. And he also wanted it to be accessible to people without means. So people came from all over the United States to go to that place in Warm Springs. So I don't think the actual diagnosis would have mattered to him so much. It wouldn't mean that he wasn't part of this community of people. And then I've read different things about Eleanor Roosevelt. I think at first, I mean, there's kind of a heartbreaking, you know, it was a story that when he was diagnosed, when he first fell ill, they were in an isolated area in Campobello Island, and so they didn't have access to good medical care or knowledge, and ended up doing things that probably made it worse because you're not supposed to, you know, he thought, oh, if I get a lot of massages, etc., this will help, and it does the opposite. It has the opposite effect. And I've read different things about her reaction to medical advice, that there was a reluctance, understandably, but there was a reluctance to admit what the diagnosis was and just think, oh, if we work harder, you know, and that certainly wasn't the case. But beyond that, everything else I've read was that she and others embraced his return to a public life because they saw this as he was ready, he was fit, he was mentally ready, he was an ambitious person. No one thought it was a good idea for him to be a recluse and to withdraw. His mother did. You know, his mother just saw his future as like her husband. And again, there's issues with that, you know, mother. But everyone else probably, you know, was willing to go along with his ambition. And clearly there were a lot of other women in his life who made that happen, not just because she had her own goals. But, you know, I think that without that support, particularly in the early stages of his illness, she was absolutely key in having him stay afloat mentally and to give him political hope for the future. So, Max, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah,
Correct?
I'd like to add a couple of things, particularly in the early years of his governorship running for president. Eleanor was very important. And she was an independent person. You know, he would sometimes make a kind of married man's wisecrack, you know. That's my missus, you know. And she's going to do what she's going to do, and I support it. I think Eleanor played a big role in there are a couple of quotes where he said, you know, she's out, she's my eyes and ears. She also played an important role. The first president, well, you know, 1920 was when women got the right to vote. And Eleanor played an important role in mobilizing the women's vote in his race for governor and in his race for president. The other ironic thing is that when he decided he was going to buy Warm Springs, she was opposed to that. But he did it anyway, and she came around.
Yeah, I'd just add that she really did have an independent mind and was a trusted, if sometimes troublesome, advisor to Franklin, who felt, I mean, she was constantly pulling him more in progressive directions, whether it was, you know, you have to do more can't you do more to get more refugees into this country, and and speaking on behalf of, workers facing difficult conditions. She went, as his eyes and ears, for example, she went down into the mines, and some people in Washington society were scandalized by the first lady with all those sweaty coal miners underground. But she said, look, he can't get here, and he needs to know from me how tough it is for these people. And so she had that role as a kind of one unofficial member of the unofficial kitchen cabinet, but somebody who was a voice who generally had good access and was speaking on behalf of those who were worse off.
Greenville, Maryland exists because of Eleanor. She felt there was a need for working people to have their own home in a kind of close to nature environment. She pushed the idea, and Franklin said, all right, go do it.
Can we get the mic to Nkenji, please?
Good evening, everyone. This was a great panel. I have a question for Nyla, your fave disabled hottie. It's okay. It's okay. She knows. As an absolute fan of yours, I'm often wondering how you have done, I think, a seemingly significant contribution, if you will, to younger people, to those in the disability community, to the Black community as a womanist. I want to know, I've been burning with this question on how do you, especially as we think about these kind of events, these kind of memorials, kind of who gets left out. Like, it was so important for you when you initially started talking to talk about the intersections, right? And I'm often wondering, how do you, especially in today where it seems like we can have so many messages, and I'm thinking about younger people, those who are students at AU in particular, it seems like a forgotten component of the civil rights movement, right? When we think about those with disabilities. Can you talk a little bit about how do you keep that voice consistent? I know it's because of who you are, but how do you keep a consistent voice, especially right now, where it seems like there is, especially for marginalized communities, Black communities in particular, where it's like there's always a fight to get that certain messages across, right? How important is that for you to stay consistent in your message? And kind of what's your message for those younger people today in the audience?
Yes, so I always felt like it was very important for me to always highlight that Black disabled people exist. Even like in my work, even now, like today, like I have to remind people that Black disabled people exist. Because whenever we talk about disability and disability rights and things like that, oftentimes Black disabled people are not in mind, just to be honest. Just about like the access to certain things, the resources and things like that. Just from my experiences, luckily, I would say that I am privileged in a way that I had my mom who used to work in the medical care, and she was able to have access to people who was very knowledgeable about disabilities and things like that. But I noticed that there was not a lot of people who had my mom or was in the right place at the right time. So they are left out, and then they end up being in places such as poverty. There's a lot of Black disabled people who are in poverty. It's a high population. They don't always have access to resources when it comes to like disability services on college campuses and things like that. And I'm just gonna be honest, they are experiencing racism. There are times where Black disabled people are not helped because they are Black, but yet let a white disabled person come into a room, then they are greeted with a lot of resources. Not saying that white disabled people don't face discrimination and ableism, like of course they do. I mean, if you are disabled, you're gonna experience some type of ableism. But if we put a Black disabled person, a white disabled person in a room, who is gonna be approached more? Who is gonna get access to certain things more? And I always found that to be very important. And I know sometimes it can be very uncomfortable, but I am that person that will make things uncomfortable in order to make change, because I always say, in order for change to happen, you have to be uncomfortable. But not only do you have to be uncomfortable, but you have to sit in that uncomfortableness. You have to ask why, you have to reflect. Because a lot of the times when we are making change and we are fighting for change, a lot of people don't like, and I love using the word ableism, I do, is that whenever I say somebody is ableist, they hate it. They want to fight. They want to be like, no, I'm not. But it's like, just sit back and sit in it. Why do you think I called you that? Let's think about the interaction. Let's think about what you've been taught. And a lot of the things that people never think about is what we have been taught. Society teaches us a lot, but it's up to us to decide if we want to unlearn those harmful beliefs or not. And I will tell this quick story. I remember I was a part of a disability organization when it came to my internship. I used to intern at the Department of Transportation, and I worked under a disability policy advisor there named Kelly Buckland. Love him, amazing. But when I was with the disability organization before I had to work with Kelly, we talked about the intersectionality of race and disability. And a lot of the people did not want to talk about their privilege. And to be honest, I will just say it. There was a lot of white disabled people who did not want to talk about their privilege. And they just want to talk about how they've been oppressed, all those things. But I was the only one was like, okay, well, let's talk about your whiteness. And I'm telling you, the whole room was going upside down that day. There was fighting. They were like, no, I'm like, no, let's talk about it. I said, because I'm a Black disabled person. I deal with racism and ableism. I said, you only deal with ableism. I said, in a way, I said, let's look around at everybody in the room. I said, it's only 4 Black disabled people who got an opportunity, but yet there's a whole bunch of white disabled people that's here. We really have to talk about the elephant in the room. I said, if we are going to talk about intersectionality, we do have to talk about the privilege of it, because it's about how your identities both give you, make you deal with discrimination as well as giving you access to certain privileges. So yes. Oh yeah, and one more, I forgot to answer the last question. And also for all the youth that's in the room, be open to being uncomfortable. I know sometimes when we go to school, we feel like we know everything. We like, oh yeah, I'm gonna make a difference. Be okay with being uncomfortable, but also being open to listen. I feel like we never really listen to each other because we always think that we know everything. You don't know everything. I have been out of school for like almost a year now, out of grad school. I'm still learning. I'm still unlearning certain things. So be okay with always being open to learning and also listening to others.
Amen.
Well, I think those are terrific notes to end on. Katie told us that presidents are weird. I think that is not a debatable point. I would end us with the point that that presidents are human, and as humans, they are capable of error and of weakness, and you know, for all of Roosevelt's vaunted empathy, it did not prevent him from making strategic alliances with segregationist Southern Democrats to get his policies through Congress. It did not extend to the 120,000 Japanese Americans that he ordered incarcerated in what turned out to be a violation of the Constitution, as the Supreme Court eventually found, and that brought an apology to the survivors of that episode in the Reagan administration from Congress, I hasten to add, not from the president. And so if one of the questions tonight is what and who are commemoration for, I would argue that what we want is complex histories of complex individuals, rather than the cover-up of any particular facet of their humanity and their time in public life, so that we can learn from it all and then make choices ourselves about how we want to live. Thank you all for choosing to spend part of your day and evening with us today, and please join us for a reception now where we can meet you individually.